40 years ago this weekend, the composer Igor Stravinsky and the poet Dylan Thomas met to discuss the idea of collaborating together on an opera. Ronald Woodley presents Dying of the Light, the story behind the project.
The piece I composed for Dylan Thomas was not intended first when I thought about Dylan Thomas. I wanted to compose with him an opera, and I waited him here, where we had to sketch this libretto for this opera. And I received a telegram that he was dead in New York. So, no more opera. It was only the regret of knowing somebody which was a wonderful poet.
The story of one of the most unlikely and, in the end, ill-fated collaborations in 20th century music began during Dylan Thomas's first visit to the United States in 1950. His work and notoriety were already known there to some extent, but for Thomas himself, the attractions of the New World had more to do with the promises of money and adoration from a wholly new audience. It was also a means of escape from the growing problems with his wife at home. Thomas had been invited, like many other British poets, by John Malcolm Brinnin to give some readings at the Poetry Centre in New York and various university campuses throughout the country. In no time, he had the American audience in his lap. But the Stravinskys, in fact, had already been introduced to his poetry 2 years before by a young conductor from New York, Robert Kraft. Kraft originally met Stravinsky in 1948, after writing to the composer to ask for a copy of the Symphonies of Wind Instruments, which he was about to conduct. But soon Kraft was invited to work as the composer's personal assistant, and he moved into their house in Los Angeles. One of the jobs assigned to him was to help Stravinsky with the pronunciation and accentuation of the English words for the opera The Rake's Progress, with a libretto by W.H. Auden and Chester Kallman. Kraft remembers that Auden arrived late at a meeting to discuss the libretto when the Stravinskys and Kraft were in New York. Auden had just been to the party welcoming Thomas to America.
The two poets had been together one day just before Auden came to the Lombardy Hotel to work with Stravinsky on The Rake. I remember Auden saying, "The poor dear's in a bad shape." It had to do with money and inebriation on Thomas's part. Auden was an odd combination of a very tight-fisted individual with relation to so many things, but very charitable. He would help anybody in need, a poet. Dylan Thomas, he would immediately have put up money for bail or whatever had happened to him, or to help him in some debt. I'm sure that something of that nature that happened.
A month later, in March 1950, Stravinsky and Thomas happened to be on the same university campus at the University of Illinois in Urbana. Stravinsky was conducting a rehearsal at the same time as Thomas was giving one of his readings nearby. Vera Stravinsky went to hear him and came back full of praise for the poet. Indeed, Robert Kraft tells us that he actually used one of Thomas's poems, In My Craft or Sullen Art, to help the Stravinskys with their still faltering English. Thomas may have been a huge success with his public readings, but his own creativity by this time was beginning to suffer. Thomas's biographer, Paul Ferris.
He seemed to have become estranged from the moods that produced his poems, although it didn't stop him writing Sir John's Hill, or poem on his birthday, and the poem, Do Not Go Gentle, to his father. I mean, he was producing good poems, but he wasn't doing it very often. I don't think many artists are capable of separating off their artistic life from their private lives. Up to a point one can do it, I think. But I think his private life was in such a muddle that the muddle dragged in. It became a sort of a whirlpool that dragged the poems down into it as well.
But Stravinsky too was in something of a creative crisis. In Paris, after a recent concert, there had been bitter protestations that his music no longer sounded as though it was at the cutting edge of the avant-garde. This was a particularly ironic twist of the knife, considering the infamous uproar in the same city at the premiere of The Rite of Spring. Now, nearly 40 years later, beside the rising stars of Boulez, Henze and Stockhausen, Stravinsky was thought by many in Europe to have slipped back into a sterile traditionalism with his so-called neoclassical works. He had heard about these protests in America, but it wasn't until he came to Europe himself in 1951 for the world premiere of The Rake's Progress in Venice that it really struck home.
He'd lost some of this position of being the leader. He wasn't anymore. That did bother him, I'm sure of it. He had been isolated in the United States for 12 years, and mostly in the West Coast. And when he first came to first performance of The Rake in Venice in 1951, during that whole trip he was hearing new music which interested him, things that had never been performed, such as in Baden-Baden tapes of Webern's orchestra variations. The Golden Calf music had just been performed in Donaueschingen. And he heard these things in all the German radio stations, things that were not done anywhere in America. So he had the most marvelous antennae. He was so alert to everything, and he quickly moved in this direction. There were some nudges from people like myself, but there were also some reactions to that. I mean, people wanted to keep him on his old course, but you could lead this horse to all kinds of liquids.
Perhaps the death of Schoenberg, too, in this same year, 1951, had its liberating effect on Stravinsky, enabling him to respond to Kraft's gentle urgings. Gradually, anyway, Stravinsky began to explore serial techniques seriously, in his own way, without directly imitating Schoenberg's 12-note system. In the context of the Dylan Thomas project, it's significant that in the cantata and the 3 Shakespeare songs, both partially serial works written between 1951 and 1953, we find Stravinsky refining further his setting of English verse. But as yet there was no really large-scale work in the pipeline through which he could work out his new ideas. Then he received a visit from the British film producer Michael Powell, and for the first time we find the names of Stravinsky and Dylan Thomas linked together.
Powell offered him a commission to compose a film score of about 30 to 40 minutes. The subject was to be the Nausicaa episode in the Odyssey, and the narration would be written by Dylan Thomas. I don't think that he remembered the Nausicaa episode. It was only when he heard the name Thomas that he sort of perked up to it. Stravinsky said that he would be interested in composing an incidental song or two with words by the poet. Apparently unable to raise money, Powell did not write for several weeks.
As it turned out, Thomas was eventually dropped from this film project, and even after he had been replaced by Simon Harcourt Smith, the whole venture foundered through lack of money. When Thomas returned for his 3rd visit to the United States in April 1953, it was a new dramatic work that he brought with him. Under Milk Wood was premiered in New York on the 14th of May 1953, at the same time as Robert Kraft was in Boston rehearsing a new production of The Rake's Progress, given by the students of the university. This was to be conducted by the composer on May the 17th.
A few days before the performance, the director of this university company workshop, Sarah Caldwell, asked me if I thought Stravinsky would accept a commission to do another opera. I knew that he wouldn't undertake a work of any length, and I said that a theater piece of some other kind might be a possibility, obviously thinking about the conversations with Michael Powell before, and that Stravinsky was willing, if he'd had a work of half an hour. I was also thinking of Delia, that's the mask that Auden and Kallman wrote for Stravinsky when he told them that an opera would be out of the question. Stravinsky did not compose Delia because the libretto had arrived in the mail a fait accompli, whereas he insisted on choosing his own subjects and participating in the scenario. A different librettist would have to be found, and I suggested Thomas.
By this time, Thomas was actually staying with John Malcolm Brinnin in Cambridge, just outside Boston. So he was easily contacted, and 4 days after the performance of The Rake, he came to visit the Stravinskys at the Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston. This was May the 22nd, 1953. It was to be the only meeting between the two artists, and both were pretty nervous. Thomas arrived, sober, to find Stravinsky in bed, recovering from the disastrous second performance of The Rake, which had ground to a halt twice due to the inexperience of the understudies who had taken over the main roles. Robert Kraft was there.
It was a tense time for him. He was terribly nervous, and he was in bed, and he was wondering how this is going to work, and what should he say, who should break the ice, who should start the conversation. So I opened the door to Thomas, and I was a little bit surprised because he was much shorter, and he certainly did not look at all well. And these sort of stiff little introductions. But quickly, Stravinsky poured a big scotch for him, and he drank that. And I don't think he ever drank scotch, so it probably really did hit him rather quickly. And so they were on quite close, friendly at least, terms right away. Before long, I could see that that Thomas had inspired a fatherly and very protective feeling in the composer. Stravinsky's Russian-style hospitality is legendary, but I'd never seen him bestow more of it than on that morning in Boston. Suddenly Thomas said that he'd heard the Rake broadcast in Venice and had thought the libretto too wordy. Knowing that Stravinsky did not accept any criticism of the libretto, I broke in and asked Thomas if he had any ideas for musico-theatrical work. Two, he said, but the one that interested him more was about the rediscovery of love and language in a world after the bomb. Stravinsky said that he would like to see what might be developed from this theme, adding that he would gladly explore it with Thomas if he would come to California in the autumn. Smoothed out by the whiskey, the worst of the jumpiness and edginess gone, Thomas began to unbutton about his personal problems. His wife was going mad. He had no money to support his children. Daily injections were required for his gout. When he said that he did not know much about opera but was fond of Puccini, Stravinsky interjected that he liked Puccini too, but added that we must first be fond of Mozart. So Thomas was uncomfortable with music, and he switched to the subject of Yeats, describing him as the greatest lyric poet in English since Shakespeare, and then reciting The Wild Old Wicked Man. The private audition was very moving. We all know Thomas's voice from recordings, but this was quieter, a little tremulous, but without the boom. When he finished, Mrs. Stravinsky said that the doctor was expected, and she repeated the invitation to stay with him in Hollywood. Thomas promised to come, and promised to send any interim ideas. Something might occur to him in New York, since he intended to stay there to escape the coronation.
Thomas was overwhelmed with excitement by the meeting, and by the time Brinnin returned to his apartment in the late afternoon, Thomas's imagination was bubbling feverishly with ideas of the world after the bomb. Brinnin records the episode in his book Dylan Thomas in America.
I had seldom observed him in so buoyant a state of creative agitation. In his talk with Stravinsky, they had outlined the idea on which they planned to proceed. They would do a recreation of the world, an opera about the only man and woman alive on Earth. These creatures might be visitors from outer space who by some cosmic mischance find themselves on an Earth recently devastated and silenced by global warfare. Or they might be Earthlings who somehow have survived an atomic miscalculation. In either case, they would re-experience the whole awakening life of Aboriginal man. They would make a new cosmogony. Confronted with a tree pushing its way upward out of radioactive dust, they would have to name it and learn its uses, and then proceed to find names and a definition for everything on Earth. The landscape would be fantastic, everything shaped and colored by the dreams of primitive man, and even the rocks and trees would sing. The music would be utterly different from the formal sophistication of the Rake's Progress, a reversion in operatic form to the earlier Stravinsky of Le Sacre du Printemps and Oiseau du Feu. Smoking one cigarette after another, circling the room as if it were a cage, Dylan seemed imagination afire.
It's very difficult to imagine exactly what the collaboration might have produced, but certainly some of the ideas discussed in the meeting between the two in the Boston Hotel have resonances in the work of both the composer and the poet. Stephen Walsh has made a particular study of the work of Stravinsky.
What seems to me about the Thomas idea, which is not very Stravinskyan, is its dependence on the sort of apparatus of the modern world. Stravinsky sometimes brings those things in, like there are telephones in The Soldier's Tale, but he brings them in as alienation devices to sort of break the idiom deliberately. I don't think he would have been at home in a subject which was a sort of modernistic subject in that way, a topical subject. I don't think he was a Zeitopper sort of man. And I think he did try to generalize it, and then he'd have worked on the cyclic elements.
The thoughts which Thomas shared with Stravinsky during their meeting were also common themes in his own later and unfinished poems. Dr. Jim Davies of the University of Wales at Swansea.
The idea that Thomas offered, to judge from what Burney Watkins wrote down when he told him, and to judge from what Fitzgibbon wrote down when Thomas told him, indeed when he told Fitzgibbon almost immediately before he went to America for the last time, it was to be a libretto about the end of the world. It was to contain elements of affirmation, that is to say, in the version he told to Burney Watkins, aliens would appear to take away the children, and an old man would then tell the aliens, and presumably the departed children, of the beauties and wonders of the earth as it was. Fitzgibbon added a few points, and those points again are quite interesting, because Fitzgibbon said that Thomas told him that he wanted to see this as a version of the Garden of Eden myth, and that the tree of knowledge appearing in this recreated world would not be sexual but linguistic. That is to say, each leaf, he said to Fitzgibbon, would have a letter, a single letter of the alphabet, and out of this would come new languages. But the languages would be all concrete. The languages would not serve abstract thought. They would be concrete and serve things, objects, people, not abstractions.
There are certain elements in that subject which are obviously Stravinskian. The idea of death and rebirth, the cyclic things that you can easily see in the background of that sort of subject, is present in almost all his theatre pieces, one way or another. It's a fundamental essence of his thinking, certainly from The Rite of Spring onwards, and possibly from Petrushka onwards. The Rite of Spring, most of all, was a piece that had hung around his neck like an albatross. He was always the composer of The Rite of Spring, and he hated that. That's why he was always changing direction. He was sidestepping popular opinion all the time. It might be that their discussions had centered on this idea of generalizing the thing into ritualistic modes with a lot of very pungent rhythms, and that might have suggested to Dylan Thomas The Rite of Spring.
One suspects, though I don't think there's any documentary evidence, that the dropping of the atom bombs in 1945 had a great effect on him, because certainly the Second World War had a great effect on him. There are a series of famous poems, of course, which he wrote in response to the Blitz. So this notion of mass destruction was something that obviously obsessed him. And after the war, he wrote in 3 places, 2 specifically, of the idea of general destruction. One, the unfinished poem In Country Heaven, which was to be part of a huge sequence, and he appended a note to that, a very long note, which referred specifically to the earth, mankind, as it were, destroying itself. But he also went on, which is perhaps interesting in the light of his future collaboration, or projected collaboration, he also went on to say that even though this poem sequence, of which very little was written, was about the devastation and destruction of the world, it would finish up as an affirmatory piece. That is to say, it would be a piece in praise of the world.
The earth has killed itself. It is black, petrified, wizened, poisoned, burst. Insanity has blown it rotten, and no creatures at all, joyful, despairing, cruel, kind, dumb, afire, loving, dull, no creatures at all, shortly and brutishly hunt their days down like enemies on that corrupted face. And the poem becomes at last an affirmation of the beautiful and terrible worth of the earth. It grows into a praise of what is and what could be on this lump in the skies. It is a poem about happiness.
The last finished poem that he produced, the prologue to the collected poems, that of course is dominated by the Noah myth, the flooding of the world, and ways in which one could survive, if one could, the idea of general destruction. Thomas, perhaps optimistically, hopefully, there's a kind of strained optimism about the poem, saw his poems as arcs, therefore as survivors of some general flooding holocaust.
Only the drowned deep bells of sheep and churches noise poor peace as the sun sets
and dark shoals every holy field. We shall ride out alone, and then under the stars of Wales cry multitudes of arcs. Across the water-lidded lands, manned with their loves, they'll move like wooden islands, hill to hill. Halloo, my proud dove, with a flute. Ahoy, old sea-legged fox, tom-tit and die-mouse. My ark sings in the sun at God's speeded summer's end, and the flood flowers now.
Stravinsky started to write The Flood after being in Venice during a flood. A real acqua alta where you walked on duck boards and you're 2-3 feet up, and we were carrying people piggyback out of the hotel. Then, not very much later, he went back to New York from Le Havre, and it was a very stormy sea, and he didn't like to go out. He had Diogenes' fear of water. Stravinsky could not swim, and I'm sure that ocean trip is when he started to make notes for libretto, at least ideas.
The Flood has plain chant, it has sort of set-piece orchestral numbers which depict aspects of the things like the building of the ark. It has a speaker, it has male voices chanting, and so on. It's much closer to the sort of very early things like The Soldier's Tale in a sort of mixture of media. But it does have elements, that kind of sort of post-disaster quality, which seems to be inherent in this Dylan Thomas libretto.
Sons, with your wives shall ye be stead.
You could see similarities there. I don't think there's any reason to suppose that there was any influence there. It might just be an accident, but I think that from that point of view, you might postulate that if the Dylan Thomas thing had got off the ground, it might have been a bit like The Flood.
In The Flood, then, written for television in 1962, we may just be able to trace some elements similar to the work that the two might have produced if the project had been realized. There were undoubtedly deep differences of personality between Stravinsky and Thomas. The poet's vision of the recreation of language after the Holocaust is a vision of a concrete language stripped of abstraction, whereas Stravinsky was cultivating an increased distancing of musical object from the world, what he called a new measure of musical time, which he considered had been discovered by Anton Webern. It's all very well to analyze these ideological discrepancies after the event. At the time, though, for Thomas especially, the immediate attractions of the collaboration were not to be underestimated.
It was like a dream within a dream. America was a dream, and the opera with Stravinsky was a dream inside that. If someone of the stature of Stravinsky was interested in collaborating with him, who wouldn't be flattered? Who wouldn't regard that as an accolade? And there was money. One can see the attraction. It put another 3,000 miles between him and Great Britain and all the family problems.
But these family problems are well and truly suppressed in the euphoric letter which Thomas wrote back to his wife Kathleen on the 23rd of May 1953. Nothing could quell his enthusiasm for the project and the money it would bring in.
We can get a boat from London, direct but slow, to San Francisco, and then fly to Los Angeles in an hour or so. Outside Hollywood, in a huge, easy house on the hills, we're to stay for a month with Stravinsky. I've seen him just now in Boston, and we've thought of an opera, and it is, for me, so simple that the libretto can be written in the time we're there. That's not just optimistic. It can and will be. In advance, I'll be given £500, and our passage, first class, and then another 500, and then royalties until we die. We'll go back from Hollywood to Larne, and in the winter we'll go to Mallorca. There'll be plenty of money. This time it's working.
But no sooner had Thomas returned to his wife in Wales than problems started to loom over the commission. Sarah Caldwell from the Opera Workshop was having difficulty persuading Boston University to sponsor the collaboration. But Stravinsky was keen to continue with the venture, even without funding. And Thomas, too, still had the project very much in his mind back home.
The Boathouse, Lawn, 16th of June, 1953. Dear Mr. Stravinsky, I was so very glad to meet you for a little time in Boston, and you and Mrs. Stravinsky couldn't have been kinder to me. I hope you get well very soon. I haven't heard anything yet from Sarah Caldwell, but I've been thinking a lot about the opera and have a number of ideas, good, bad, and chaotic. As soon as I can get something down on paper, I should, if I may, love to send it to you. I broke my arm just before leaving New York the week before last and can't write properly yet. It was only a little break, they tell me, but it cracked like a gun. I should very much like, if you think you would still like me to work with you, and I'd be enormously honored and excited to do that, to come to California in late September or early October. Would that be convenient? I hope so. And by that time I hope, too, to have some clearer ideas about a libretto. Thank you again, and please give my regards to your wife and to Mr. Kraft. Yours sincerely, Dylan Thomas.
The Stravinskys started to make elaborate preparations for Thomas's arrival in California.
They tore their house apart, which seems to me as rather marvelous and generous of them. They had a little dacha up in a hillside. There was only one bedroom. When I first lived there, I slept on a couch and a small dining room, which the back entrance to that, they knocked out wall, and they built an extra room there for him. But they didn't really want that room. They really thought that he had no money, and that if he lived there with them and could concentrate and not go out very much and stay there, I don't know what they had in mind, probably a month. They would have to do that. They'd have to work back and forth. The Stravinskys were revered this room, and guests who came or visitors who came to the house in the future, it was always pointed out, this was the Dylan Thomas room. We made this room when we had expected him to come and to collaborate on something or other, and it was done entirely for him.
The Boathouse, Lawn, 22nd of September, 1953. Dear Igor Stravinsky, thank you very, very much for your two extremely nice letters and for showing me the letter you had written to Mr. Choate of Boston University. I would have written again long before this, but I kept on waiting until I knew for certain when I would be able to come to the States. Now it is certain that I shall be in New York on the 16th of October, and I'll have to stay there giving some poetry readings and taking part in a couple of performances of a small play of mine until the end of October. I should like then, if I may, to come straight to California to be with you and to get down together to the first stage of our work. I'm sure I needn't tell you how excited I am to be able to write down that word, our. It's wonderful to think of. One of my chief troubles is, of course, money. I haven't any of my own. The man who's arranged my readings in October at a few Eastern universities and at the Poetry Center, New York, is paying my expenses to and from New York, but from there to California, I will have to pay my own way on what I can make out of these readings. I do hope it will work out all right. I'd relied on drawing my traveling expenses, etc., from the original Boston University Commission. I want to bring my wife, Kathleen, with me, and she thinks she can stay with a friend in San Francisco while I am working with you in Hollywood. Anyway, I'll have to work these things out the best I can, and I mustn't bother you with them now. The main thing I know is for me to get to you as soon as possible, so that we can begin, whatever it will turn out to be. I've been thinking an awful lot about it. I'm looking forward enormously to meeting you again and to working with you, and I promise not to tell anyone about it, though it's very hard not to. Most sincerely, Dylan Thomas.
Stravinsky waited over a month in Hollywood for news of Thomas's arrival. And in New York, the Poetry Center were expecting him on the 14th of October, but he missed his flight and arrived 5 days late.
He was physically in a bad way. He always suffered from various kinds of digestive problems, which were probably to do with drink, probably to do with simply too much booze and not enough food. So that he was ill in that sense. And he seems to have been psychologically unwell. I mean, whether he was a bit psychotic, as some people say, I don't know. But he was certainly suffering. He seemed to have a permanent hangover, I suppose you could say. He'd been having blackouts in Wales, it was said. And his affairs were in a muddle. On the one hand, he was promising his wife that they'd go off and live in a sort of a fairyland in California, and he'd be writing writing the opera with Stravinsky and so on, and all would be sunshine and light. On the other hand, he was falling into the arms of his mistress, Elizabeth Rytell, whom he'd met on his previous visit in the spring of 53. And he spent the last days of his life more or less in her company. There's the story that he was drinking too much. He was being visited by a doctor, by Felsenstein, for associated problems, DTs, and goodness knows what. There's the story that he staggered out and went to the White Horse Tavern in Greenwich Village and came back and said, whatever it was, 18 straight whiskies, that's the record, which is almost certainly nonsense. He didn't drink 18 straight whiskies. He went off and, had some booze as usual, but he was exaggerating, he was posturing a bit. And Felsenstein gave him an injection of, I forget what it was it a third of a grain of morphia? Anyway, it was an amount that sounds very little, but in fact is very substantial. He was having breathing problems anyway, and it turns out to have been quite the wrong advice. And he rapidly went into coma. The effect of the morphine was to depress his respiratory function. And he was in bed, talking in the hotel bedroom in the Chelsea Hotel, talking to Liz Rytell, and she saw his lips turning blue. And that was it. He never regained consciousness.
The Stravinskys lived on the side of a hill, and there were about 30 steps from the street of a very sparsely populated section of Beverly Hills. You could hear a car coming up the hillside. They were that rare. I was near the front door, and I got the telegram and opened it, and I was puzzled myself because it had mistakes in it. It didn't say Dylan Thomas, Welsh poet, died. It said Welsh poet, and then it's something about death, and it was not immediately clear. So that's why we telephoned New York. And we didn't hear from Thomas after the second letter, but they were expecting him about this time, and they were mentioning each day, well, why don't we hear? There was a lot of anxiety, and they were looking forward to this. They were generally looking forward to it. I was dreading it in a way, because I don't like, not fights, but things don't work out. It bothers me more than probably lots of people, but, and I was feeling also, I'm going to be in some situation here because I'm going to have to explain certain things, and I don't really know how to do it. So when I read this, and I think I understood, I showed it to Mrs. Stravinsky, and she told Stravinsky in her way and in Russian. And there are all sorts of rituals about bad news in Russian. So I'm sure that she introduced this subject that way. And he started to cry. He went into his room and closed the door, and he didn't talk all day. And he was red-eyed. I'm told by his daughter that she saw him cry only once in his life, and that's when his elder daughter died, and that Russians lie flat on the floor at death. It was a big shock. I think probably he thought, as I have tried to explain, that some sort of father-son relationship, and he felt that he might save Thomas. That is going a bit far, because I don't have any, obviously no documents saying that, but that's my feeling, that he almost welcomed that. He liked people, somebody he felt had an enormous talent and it was misused, and he's in a bad way, and Stravinsky would have liked to have helped him. He didn't feel this way about any of his children, didn't feel this way about me. He had a very tender feeling about this man. Now, you say that's not possible in a meeting. I don't know how long it was, an hour and a half.
There is no doubt that he did have an impact on people. The impact may have been that sometimes they felt certainly women wanted to mother him, that he could make people laugh a lot. It's something that's very difficult to calibrate in any way. But I think that he sometimes had an effect on people far beyond the length of time he spent with them. I think that's true.
Certainly, the effect which Thomas had had on Stravinsky seems to have been out of all proportion to the brief time they had shared together in the Boston hotel room and the few letters which had passed between them. The joint project, if it could ever have materialized, would have been truly fascinating. Of that there can be little doubt. In the end, it came to nothing. But, in a sense, a kind of collaboration did take place, even if it was a posthumous one. For Stravinsky did compose a setting of Thomas's poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, for tenor solo and string quartet. Adding a somber quartet of trombones, which frame the song itself, he called the piece In Memoriam Dylan Thomas, Dirge, Canons and Song. In fact, the work, written in 1954, was more than canonic. Stravinsky had finally adopted a more strictly serial mode of composition. The trombones were added when Kraft told him that Schutz's Fili Mi Absalon was going to be performed in the same concert. Indeed, Kraft's choice of the Schutz work seems to have been inspired by the parable of a father mourning his son. The world premiere was conducted by Robert Kraft on September the 20th, 1954, as part of the Monday evening concerts in Los Angeles. Aldous Huxley, a long-standing friend of the Stravinskys and admirer of Thomas's poetry, gave a dedicatory address.
It was the outstanding concert, I would say, of the history of that series. A new piece, a premiere by Stravinsky, would always bring an audience, but Dylan Thomas had left some impression on Los Angeles by reading at the universities, and everybody was reading him then, and there were recordings already. The hall quickly filled up. Lots of people didn't get in. It wasn't a very large hall. It's a horrible place. It looks like a high school auditorium. And it opened with some Renaissance Viennese instrumental music, using the trombones that occur in Schutz and in the In Memoriam. Then Aldous spoke. He was saying how rare a thing it is in the world to have a lyric poet, and what a terrible tragedy it is that we've lost perhaps the purest of the lyric poets. He had very high regard for Dylan, and he was very brief, very moving. Then we played this piece. I don't remember whether it was silent or whether there was applause. Immediately, I mean. Obviously there was, because it was encored. I think it was encored after an intermission, however, to give a little time. But it was very moving. It was well performed, well sung. It was a very emotional and very moving occasion.
I wanted to compose with him an opera, and I received a telegram that he was dead in New York. So, no more opera. It was only the regret of knowing somebody which was a wonderful poet. And I always have his portrait with me, as I loved him very much. And so I composed a little piece of music in his memory. I was very sad. I don't know if the music translated this sadness.